Savannah Cole adjusted the cuffs of her dove-gray coat as the glass doors of Cole Dynamics hissed open, swallowing her and her twin stroller into the marbled expanse of Midtown Manhattan's most intimidating fortress. It smelled like power, cool air, expensive cologne, and the faint static of digital dominance. Her heels clicked across the polished floor, measured and unhurried. She had practiced this walk, this silence. 5 years. 5 years since she'd last stepped foot in this building. Back then, she was just Savannah Hart, Jackson Cole's bright-eyed, fiercely loyal wife, event planner turned executive assistant, and later, the woman everyone whispered about when the headlines turned savage. Wife or thief? Gold digger's fall. Cole's catastrophe. Now, she was Savannah Hart Cole, mother of twins, MBA graduate, and, for the moment, calm. "Mommy," Sophia whispered from the stroller, tugging on Savannah's gloved hand. "Eli took my gummy bears." Savannah crouched, smoothing her daughter's curls and handing her the tiny snack pack again. "He's just pretending to be hungry. We have a deal, remember?" Sophia nodded solemnly. "Best behavior." "Best behavior," Savannah echoed, standing tall as a security guard approached. "Ma'am," he said, eyes scanning the stroller before lifting to meet hers and stopping. Recognition bloomed slowly across his face, his hand pausing over his radio. Is that really you?" he asked. "Good morning, Marcus." Savannah's smile was tight but gracious. "Tell Olivia I'm here to see Mr. Cole." He hesitated. "Is he expecting you?" "No," Savannah said evenly, pulling out a visitor's badge she'd had printed the night before. "But he'll want to see this." She held up a slim silver USB drive, its edges worn from how often she'd rolled it between her fingers like a worry stone. Marcus nodded, visibly sweating now. "Take the executive lift. Top floor." The ride-up was silent except for the soft hum of the elevator and Eli's quiet humming. Savannah stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, elegant, composed, and a little too pale. The woman looking back at her was a stranger to the girl who once packed Jackson's lunch when he was too busy coding to eat. That girl had loved him completely, recklessly. This woman, she had a plan. Through the tinted glass of the elevator, Manhattan sprawled below, blurred by the soft haze of a gray December morning. Skyscrapers reached like ambition into the sky. Once, this view made her feel powerful. Now it just reminded her how easily a person could vanish in all that height. 5 years ago, she'd fallen from this very summit, thrown out without a chance to explain, her name smeared by the man who had once sworn to protect her. And he'd never even known she was pregnant. She exhaled slowly as the doors opened with a soft ding, revealing the top floor. All chrome, glass, and the subtle menace of curated success. Cole Dynamics' empire, Jackson's kingdom. And she was about to bring it all to its knees, not with screaming or drama, but with truth. Because the truth, she'd learned, was the most dangerous weapon of all. She pushed the stroller forward. Every step echoed like a countdown. Her mind flicked back to those first nights alone in the Hamptons, curled on the hardwood floor of a borrowed cottage, sick and terrified with twins on the way. No job, no money, just shame in the tabloids and a frozen joint bank account. Theo had taken her in without question. Lena had dropped everything to start digging into the discrepancies. Savannah hadn't had time to grieve her marriage. She'd been too busy surviving. Now, she didn't come for sympathy. She came for the truth to be seen, unvarnished and undeniable. She came for her children. She came for herself, and she came with receipts. As Savannah approached the frosted glass conference doors, she caught a glimpse of Jackson through the panel, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, commanding the room. His face hadn't changed much, still devastating, still distant. Only now, She could see the cracks, the hard set of his jaw, the stress in his posture, the loneliness even billions couldn't erase. He had everything, except them. Eli reached for his sister's hand in the stroller, their small fingers threading together in an unconscious gesture that squeezed Savannah's heart. She wasn't just a mother or an ex-wife or a woman scorned. She was the storm they never saw coming. And today, the past would stop being quiet. The conference room went silent. Not corporate quiet. Not the kind of lull that followed a bad earnings report or a failed merger. This was breath-held, throat-tight silence, the kind that dropped into a room like a storm cloud moments before lightning struck. Jackson Cole's voice faltered mid-sentence, the presentation clicker slipping from his hand and clattering against the table. He turned toward the glass doors, his face blanching as Savannah stepped inside with slow, deliberate grace. She held her chin high. Beside her, the double stroller rolled forward like an offering or a threat. Eli peeked out, eyes big, curious. Sophia clutched her stuffed bunny, wide-eyed but calm. "Good morning," Savannah said, her voice smooth but heavy with implication. "I thought the board might want to see my presentation before making any major decisions today." Jackson stood frozen, shoulders stiff beneath his tailored navy suit. His gaze flicked from Savannah to the children, and stayed there. She watched it happen. The double take, the moment his brain caught up with his eyes. Eli had his jawline. Sophia had his eyes. Both bore that faint, unmistakable dimple in their left cheek. "Savannah," he finally said, his voice low, unreadable. "Mr. Cole," she replied, dropping his name like a cold stone on polished marble. A murmur rippled through the room. Olivia, Jackson's assistant, half rose from her seat, her hand fluttering toward her phone. Delilah Vaughn, seated beside Jackson, in an ice-white blouse and diamond earrings too big for daylight, stiffened like a statue. Savannah walked to the head of the table and placed a silver USB drive on the gleaming surface. "This contains audited records, asset trails, and communications that I believe your compliance team missed, but we can get to that." She turned slightly, her voice tightening. "First, introductions." She knelt beside the stroller, brushing Sophia's curls away from her face. "These are Eli and Sophia." She straightened, looking directly at Jackson. "Your children." Gasps, audible, scattered. Jackson's eyes never left the twins. "That's not possible," he said hoarsely. You left." Savannah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, Jackson, you left. I came home from a charity gala to find my things in boxes and my name blacklisted from every bank account I'd ever touched." Her voice cracked slightly, then sharpened. "I was 3 months pregnant. You never let me explain. You were too busy believing Delilah's whisper campaign to even ask if any of it was true." Delilah's face barely moved, but her grip tightened around her Mont Blanc pen. Savannah saw it, the flicker of fear behind her designer calm. Jackson blinked, swallowing hard. "You should have told me. You should have listened." Silence fell again, thicker this time. Savannah didn't look away from him. She didn't flinch, even as the twin storms of grief and fury swirled in his expression. There was pain there, yes, but too late. Too neat. He looked like a man watching the movie of his life and realizing he'd slept through the best part. I didn't know," Jackson said. His voice cracked at the edges. "I never... God, Savannah. Why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you... Beg?" she offered. "Grovel. Try to convince you I wasn't a thief when you had your CFO feeding you spreadsheets and your lawyers drafting gag orders?" Her voice was soft now, deadly. "I was humiliated, alone, pregnant, and you made sure no one in your world would touch me again." Sophia yawned. Savannah reached into her bag and handed both kids their tablets. The tension in the room was so thick it made the twins' calm even more eerie. "I rebuilt my life," she continued, turning back to the board. "I didn't come here for a reunion. I came here because your company is compromised, financially, ethically. And unless you want a media disaster, you'll let me show you how deep the rot goes." She looked to Delilah. Their eyes locked. Delilah's expression didn't break, but her fingers twitched. Jackson finally looked away from the twins and turned to Delilah, his voice quieter now. "Tell me you didn't know about this." Delilah offered a sad smile. "Of course I didn't. Savannah's very good at playing victim. She always had a flair for performance." It was the wrong thing to say. The board bristled. Savannah didn't take the bait. "Let's begin," she said, gesturing to Olivia. "Would you mind pulling up my files?" Olivia hesitated, then looked to Jackson. He gave the smallest nod. As the screen flickered to life behind her, Savannah moved to the window and looked out over the city that had once buried her. Today, she wasn't buried. She was back, and the man who had once thrown her away was now the one who looked lost. He had no idea how much more she had to show him. Savannah stood still as the first slide clicked into place behind her. The glow from the massive screen cast her silhouette across the boardroom floor. Lines of code, offshore accounts, transaction timestamps. It all looked sterile, black and white, but to her it was blood and betrayal. Years of it. "I won't bore you with the full audit," she said, facing the room. "Just the highlights." Delilah crossed her legs slowly, that too smooth smile still pinned in place like a brooch. "Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify that this woman has no legal standing." "Yet," Savannah interrupted. She didn't raise her voice, but the words sliced through the air. "Not yet, but as of 9 a.m., our legal team, mine and my sister's, filed an official whistleblower report with the SEC, the same agency that will soon have access to everything you're seeing on this screen. So, Ms. Vaughn, I'd suggest you hold your objections for your attorney." A hush fell over the room. Even Olivia blinked. Savannah knew she was overstepping every line, but she also knew one thing. Bullies hated calm. She gestured to the screen. "This is a shell company registered in Belize under the name Meridian Ventures, supposedly handling licensing fees for Coal Dynamics' European patents. Except..." She clicked again. The only money flowing out was redirected to a private account in Zurich, tied to a trust managed by an alias linked to Ms. Vaughn's personal assistant. She turned to the board, her voice even. $18 million. Disappeared over 4 years. No one moved. Jackson's face was unreadable, but she saw his jaw clench. "This is a mistake," Delilah said, a little too quickly. "She's twisting numbers to fit a narrative." Savannah's smile was almost kind. "I'm not the one who twisted anything. That credit belongs to my sister Lena, a forensic accountant who spent the last 3 years quietly tracing the money that supposedly vanished after I left." She paused. "She found every dollar, and none of it was mine." Jackson stood suddenly, pushing away from the table. He walked to the window. Classic move, the way he did when he was trying to hide his reaction. Savannah used to admire that control. Now she found it cowardly. "Why now?" he asked, not turning around. "Why come back? You could have buried me anonymously." Savannah took a slow breath, because this was the moment that mattered. Not the data, not the drama. This. She stepped closer. "Because I didn't just want revenge, Jackson. I wanted my name back." He turned. His face was tight, his expression somewhere between disbelief and pain. "You think this clears you?" She held his gaze. "It clears the record. Nothing will clear the way you looked at me the night you had security escort me out." He flinched. "Good. Let it land. I was pregnant, scared, and you didn't even ask me if it was true, she added quietly. You just believed her. He didn't answer, and in that silence, everything from the past 5 years echoed between them. Savannah turned to the board. My proposal is simple, she said. I'm not here to destroy coal dynamics. I'm here to stabilize it, because whether you like it or not, this company is part of my children's future, and I refuse to let them inherit a legacy built on lies. The final slide appeared behind her. A proposed restructuring plan with Savannah's name listed as Executive Chair of Compliance and Strategic Operations. And let's be clear, this isn't charity, she added. You need me. You've got a scandal on your hands, a weakened board, and your largest shareholder group is already murmuring about a hostile buyout. You can pretend everything's fine, or you can let someone who actually gives a damn about the future of this place clean it up. The silence stretched long enough to hear a siren outside on 6th Avenue. Finally, Jackson spoke again. You want a seat at the table? I built half this table, she replied. I just stopped asking for permission to sit at it. Across the room, Delilah stood abruptly, gathering her things. This is a circus. No, Savannah said. This is called accountability. It's been a while since you've had to sit through one of those. Delilah's heels clicked as she left. No one stopped her. Savannah reached for the twins' stroller, brushing Eli's hair back as he dozed. The storm inside her hadn't passed, but something shifted. Not closure. Not yet. But control. She turned to Jackson one last time before exiting. You may still have your company, but I have the truth, and that, Jackson, is worth more than everything you left me with. She walked out before he could reply. Savannah hadn't made it 10 steps outside the boardroom before Jackson caught up. Savannah, he called, voice quieter than she expected. Not angry, not commanding, just careful. She turned slowly, facing him in the hushed corridor. The twins were quiet in their stroller, Eli still dozing, Sophia watching the ceiling lights pass overhead with sleepy fascination. What now? She asked. I need to talk to you alone. Savannah raised a brow. 5 years of silence, and now you want privacy? He swallowed. Please. That word, please, didn't suit him. It snagged on his tongue like it wasn't made to be used by men like Jackson Cole. She nodded once. 10 minutes. They walked in silence to his office, sleek, sky-high, soulless. It was just as she remembered. Cold lines, brushed steel, panoramic windows showcasing the city he ruled. But it felt emptier now. Or maybe she had just stopped romanticizing the view. He closed the door behind them, leaned against it like he needed the wall to keep him standing. I didn't know, he said. About them. About you. Savannah unbuckled Sophia, lifting her into her arms with practiced ease. The toddler curled into her shoulder, thumb in mouth, safe and oblivious. I believe that, Savannah said, but not because I trust you. Because I know how good Delilah was at covering her tracks. I lived it. He nodded slowly, watching Sophia. His face twisted in something close to grief. She has your eyes, he whispered. Savannah looked down at her daughter. And your stubbornness. Jackson stepped forward, stopping just shy of reaching for her. Can I? He gestured awkwardly. No. Her voice was gentle but firm. Not yet. He exhaled through his nose and sat down on the edge of the glass desk. You were pregnant, and I threw you out. Yes. I've replayed that night 100 times. 1,000. His voice broke a little. You have to know I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence, it was all there. She looked at him. Really looked. At the tired shadows under his eyes, the faint silver creeping into his hairline. His suit was still perfect. His empire still massive. But the man in front of her looked smaller than the one she remembered. "I tried, Jackson," she said. "I begged you to look at me, to ask questions. You had already made up your mind. I thought I was protecting the company. You destroyed your family instead." Silence filled the space between them, thick and weighted. He nodded once, as if absorbing a blow. "And now?" "Now," Savannah said, settling Sophia back into the stroller. "I'm not interested in revenge. I want the truth on record. I want Delilah gone, and I want my children protected. That's all." Jackson stood. "That's not all, Savannah. If it were, you wouldn't have done it like this. In front of the board, the kids in the room. You wanted me to feel it." Her jaw clenched. He wasn't wrong. She turned to the window. "You remember what it felt like to be humiliated in a room full of people, Jackson? To have everything you built taken away in a single breath?" He didn't answer. "Now you do." He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. It made her skin prickle. "You didn't just come here with files," he said softly. "You came here with fire." Savannah met his gaze. "I had to become fire. It's the only way women like me survive men like you." For a second, something passed between them. Something old and wounded and sharp with memory. The years hadn't erased the gravity that pulled them together, but it had changed its shape. No longer infatuation, something messier, something truer. Jackson took a breath. "I want to know them. My children." "You'll have to earn that," she said. "They're not part of a second chance. They're not leverage. They're people, Jackson, little people, and they don't know who you are." He nodded. "Then let me show them." Savannah hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to shield her kids from everything she'd endured. But another part, quieter and harder to hear, whispered something else. They deserve a father. Even if you don't trust the man yet, they deserve to choose for themselves. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But don't push me." "I won't." She pushed the stroller toward the door, pausing before leaving. "And Jackson?" "Yeah?" "You still have no idea what else I've been building." Then she left, her children in tow, her spine straight, her world no longer orbiting around him. Delilah Vaughn didn't throw tantrums. She wielded control like a blade, silent, clean, and deadly. So when she entered her corner office 10 minutes after Savannah's bombshell and closed the door behind her, there were no slammed drawers, no broken glass. Just the sound of a diamond bracelet hitting her marble desk and the quiet exhale of a woman calculating her next move. She'd underestimated Savannah. That was her first mistake. The second had been thinking Jackson wouldn't hesitate to bury her if given a good enough reason. Her fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, summoning a contact buried under the name Baxter. Within seconds, a reply blinked back. "Ready when you are." Delilah smiled. If Savannah thought she could storm back in, babies in tow, and unravel everything Delilah had built, she didn't know the game as well as she thought. Savannah might have the truth, but Delilah had timing. Meanwhile, Savannah stood in the elevator, watching the floors light up in reverse. The twins had fallen asleep again. It amazed her how they could nap through so much. Boardroom tension, corporate warfare, the quiet rage vibrating in her chest. They were her peace and her pulse all at once. But even peace had its cracks. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "You hit hard. Too hard, maybe. Be careful. She'll retaliate." Savannah tucked the phone away without replying, too late to tread lightly now. Still, as she stepped into the bright lobby of Coal Dynamics, her nerves hummed. She had done what she came to do, taken control of the narrative, reclaimed her name. But part of her, the part that still remembered what Jackson's touch felt like against her skin in the middle of the night, hated how much he still got under her skin. Let it go, she told herself. He was a complication, not a destination. But complications had a way of circling back. 3 hours later, back in her Brooklyn brownstone, courtesy of Lena's connections and a private lease with no traceable name, Savannah sipped tea while Theo stirred a simmering pot on the stove. He moved like he always had, quiet, steady, grounding. The kitchen smelled like roasted garlic and patience. "You made the news," he said, not looking up. "I figured," Savannah murmured. "Let me guess, my face and the twins. Headlines about betrayal, secrets, scandal, Billionaire's hidden heirs or something." Theo shot her a glance. More like Ice Queen returns to burn Empire down. But yeah, close. She laughed, but it didn't quite reach her chest. The media loves a woman with teeth until she actually bites. Theo turned off the burner and leaned on the counter. He looked like hell. Savannah didn't ask who he was. She knew. "I wasn't trying to hurt him," she said softly. "Not really." "But you did." "I had to." She looked down into her mug. He needed to see what he'd done. He needed to feel it. Theo nodded, then reached into the drawer for 2 plates. "You're not the same girl who ran to me with shaking hands and nothing but a bag of clothes." Savannah smiled faintly. "Good." She was naive. "She was hurt," he corrected. "And kind. Still is, I think, underneath the armor." Savannah took a breath. "He wants to know them. The twins." Theo's hand paused over the silverware. "And what do you want?" She hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? "I want them safe. I want them to know where they come from, but not at the cost of their peace. I don't know if Jackson can give them that." "Then don't rush it," he said simply. "Let them lead." Savannah nodded. "I told him he'd have to earn it." Theo's smile was sad, but steady. "Just make sure he doesn't earn you back in the process." She froze. Theo turned away before she could respond, busying himself with plating pasta like he hadn't just thrown a match into a room doused in old feelings. But the embers were real, and whether she liked it or not, the fire had never truly gone out. Back at Coal Dynamics, Jackson stood in his office, the USB still in his hand. He hadn't plugged it in yet. He didn't need to. Savannah's words echoed louder than any file ever could. "You should have listened. You destroyed your family." And yet, when he closed his eyes, all he saw were those 2 small faces. Eli's sleepy scowl, Sophia's tiny dimple. His children. They'd been right there, feet from his desk, living proof of everything he'd lost. A knock at the door pulled him back. Olivia entered, her expression strained. "There's a press leak," she said. "Delilah's pushing a counter-story. That Savannah's unstable, that she faked the data." Jackson's stomach turned. "Don't engage," he said quickly. "Not yet." "Not yet?" He looked out the window, the city stretching into the fading orange of evening. "She's coming for blood," he murmured, "and I owe her too much to let someone else draw it first." Olivia hesitated. "You still love her?" Jackson didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know if he still had the right. Savannah couldn't sleep. The brownstone was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every thought louder. Outside, the Brooklyn night hummed. Horns in the distance, footsteps on the sidewalk, the soft rumble of the subway beneath the street. Familiar sounds, comforting even. But inside her chest, everything was clenched. She sat at the kitchen table in a hoodie and leggings, her laptop open, spreadsheets glowing. Not corporate ones, these were hers. The infrastructure of the independent consulting agency she'd built over the past 2 years, strategic partnerships, startup audits, recovery plans for companies on the brink. She'd made herself indispensable in circles Jackson would never have thought to look. Yet her hands hovered over the keyboard. Truth was, she wasn't working. Not really. She was avoiding. Avoiding the memory of Jackson's face when she said, "You destroyed your family." The way he looked at the twins like he'd seen ghosts. The part of her that had once loved him, deeply, completely, kept replaying it all, over and over, like her heart didn't know the difference between memory and mistake. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. She turned to see Lena, wrapped in a cardigan and half asleep, padding toward the fridge. "You okay?" Lena murmured, pulling out a bottle of water. "I'm fine," Savannah lied. Lena gave her a long look, then sat across from her and rested her cheek on one hand. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where you pretend your heart isn't breaking just because your posture's good." Savannah sighed. "It's not breaking." "It's bending," Lena corrected. "Under the weight of 5 years you've refused to feel." Savannah stared at her screen. "I'm trying to keep the focus on the kids, on the company. I don't have time to grieve? To admit you might still care about the man who hurt you?" "No," Savannah snapped. "To fall back into something that almost destroyed me." Lena was quiet for a moment. "I get it. I do. But loving someone doesn't make you weak, Sav, and neither does admitting you still carry them." Savannah's throat tightened. "Even if he earns a place in their lives," Lena continued, "doesn't mean he earns a place in yours, but pretending he never had one won't protect you." Savannah closed the laptop gently. "You didn't come down here just to be wise, did you?" Lena smiled. "Number I came for ice cream." Savannah laughed, grateful for the release, however brief. As Lena rummaged through the freezer, Savannah leaned back and looked toward the window. The city never stopped moving, even when she did. And somewhere out there Jackson was probably doing the same, replaying conversations, questioning choices, wondering what came next. She hated that part of her, still wondered too. Across the river, Jackson stood in the penthouse suite he once shared with her, untouched since the day she left. He'd never moved back in. He'd kept the place because the view made him feel like he'd won something. But tonight, the skyline just looked like a long line of things he couldn't fix. The file from the USB sat on the coffee table, untouched. Not because he didn't believe her, but because he did. And he couldn't stomach reading it. Delilah had betrayed him. Preston, too. But the deeper betrayal had been his own. His refusal to trust Savannah when it mattered most. He thought he was protecting the company. In truth, he'd been protecting his ego. And now there were kids. His kids. That realization still stunned him. He had missed first steps, first words. He didn't know what kind of juice they liked or what song calmed them down at night. He didn't know them, and they didn't know him. But he wanted to. He needed to. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Press is asking about the twins." Delilah leaked internal memos claiming Savannah falsified the data. "Want to respond?" Jackson stared at the screen, then typed back, "Not yet, but prep a formal statement. The truth's coming out, on our terms." He paced the room, then stopped at the small hallway where a single framed photo still hung. Him and Savannah, laughing on a ski trip in Vermont. Her cheeks were flushed, snow in her hair, arms wrapped around him like she had no reason to doubt him. He hadn't had the heart to take it down. He wasn't sure if that made him pathetic or honest. Probably both. The next morning, Savannah stood outside a Manhattan cafe, twins in tow, waiting for Lena to meet her. Theo approached instead. She blinked, surprised. "What are you—" "Lena asked me to sub in," he said, holding up 2 coffees. "Something about you needing something warm that isn't defensive and exhausting." Savannah smirked. She's not wrong. They sat on a bench nearby, the twins playing on the grass with their new sticker books. You okay? Theo asked. No, she said simply, but I'm surviving. Theo passed her the coffee. You always do. I don't want to just survive anymore, she said softly. Then don't. Savannah looked at him. His eyes were steady, gentle, filled with the kind of care that had no conditions attached. She'd leaned on him more than she ever admitted, but she wasn't sure if she'd ever leaned back. You know, he said after a moment, you don't have to fight every moment. Some things, they're worth letting in. She looked out at the twins. Maybe, she whispered. She wasn't ready to let Jackson in. But the war inside her, the one between vengeance and vulnerability, was just beginning. And it wasn't as one-sided as she'd hoped. Savannah hadn't heard her sister cry in over 10 years. Not when their mother died. Not when Savannah was thrown out of her marriage and left to rebuild from the ground up. Lena had always been steel, smart, calm, relentless. The kind of woman who could walk through fire and adjust her blazer afterward. But tonight, Lena sat on Savannah's worn brownstone couch, mascara streaked beneath her glasses, the rigid line of her mouth broken. Savannah put down the mug of tea she'd made and knelt in front of her. Lena, what happened? I lost it, Lena said quietly. I snapped at the firm partner today. Full-on snapped. I've never done that. You've been running on fumes for years, Savannah said, taking her hand. You never stop. Lena let out a bitter laugh. And now, they're pulling my name from the SEC report. Conflict of interest. Said the optics are too personal. Savannah's chest tightened. You did everything to build that case. I know, Lena said, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. But I'm the sister of the scandal, not the expert anymore, just another woman with a personal vendetta. Savannah sat beside her, silence stretching between them. The weight of it wasn't new. They had both learned long ago that some rooms didn't welcome women with truth unless it came with a man's signature attached. I don't regret it, Lena said finally. Giving it all up, the partner track, the credibility, I did it for you, for the twins. I never wanted you to carry that, Savannah said, voice cracking. You didn't ask me to, Lena whispered. But what else was I supposed to do? Watch them erase you? For a moment, neither of them spoke. Savannah reached for her sister's hand again. You're still the smartest person in every room, and you don't need a firm's letterhead to prove it. Lena gave her a shaky smile. You sound like Dad. Savannah snorted. Please don't say that. One of us still pays our taxes. They both laughed, the kind that comes with tears still in the corner of your eyes. After a moment, Lena straightened. Delilah's pushing back harder than we thought. There's a new narrative floating through the investor calls. That you're unstable. That you timed this to sink the company during acquisition talks with that European firm. Savannah's eyebrows lifted. I didn't even know about the acquisition. Well, she's saying you did. She's framing it like a long con, jilted wife turned corporate saboteur. Savannah stood, the familiar tightness returning to her spine. And Jackson? Quiet so far, Lena said, but he's not denying anything either. Savannah turned toward the kitchen, needing space, needing air. The twins were upstairs asleep, their faces peaceful and unaware of the power games unfolding below. I can't let her win, she said. Not after everything. Not with the truth sitting in plain sight. You won't, Lena said. But don't do it for me, or for Jackson, or even to get even. Savannah looked over her shoulder. Do it because you're the one person in this mess who doesn't need to lie to get what she deserves. The next day, Jackson was waiting outside the brownstone. No guards, no SUV. Just him, in a charcoal coat and worn jeans, holding a small, hopeful-looking bag from a toy store. Savannah opened the door halfway. "You have 10 minutes." He nodded. "Fair." She didn't invite him in, but she stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. "I came to see the kids," he said. "They're at preschool." Jackson hesitated, shifting the bag from one hand to the other. "Then I guess I came to see you." She crossed her arms. "Why?" "I read the report," he said. "All of it. Lena's work is airtight. If I had seen even half of that back then." "But you didn't." He winced. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. I know I can't undo what I did." "Then what do you want, Jackson?" He met her eyes, and for once he didn't look like a billionaire or a CEO. He looked like a man with regrets too heavy for his tailored coat. "I want to start again," he said. "Not with us. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But with them. I want to be their father. I want to earn their trust. One day at a time." Savannah searched his face for signs of performance, for ego, for polished manipulation. But all she saw was a man trying to rebuild from the rubble. "And when Delilah drags my name through the mud?" she asked. "When this turns into another scandal? You going to stand there and let it happen?" "No," he said quietly. "I'm going to hold a press conference tomorrow. I'll clear your name publicly, fully, with the documents and the timeline." Her arms dropped to her sides. "I should have done it already," he added. "I was trying to protect the company, but I forgot what we built before it all got twisted." Savannah stepped back just slightly, not to close the door, just to breathe. "Do it, Jackson," she said, "but not for me." He nodded. "For the kids." And for the first time, maybe ever, she believed him. As he walked away, Savannah felt something strange rise in her chest. Not hope exactly, but a soft loosening. A tiny space where maybe, just maybe, something new could grow. Not a romance, not a reconciliation, not yet, but maybe a beginning. Savannah didn't believe in turning points anymore. She believed in pressure points, in moments that pressed hard enough to show you who you were when the world stopped pretending. And the moment her phone rang the next morning, just after she'd dropped the twins off at preschool and before she could even finish her first sip of coffee, she felt it. The pressure. "Savannah," came the voice on the line. It was Raymond Thorne, lead investor in Coal Dynamics, and a man who made most CEOs tremble with a single raised eyebrow. "I'm calling with a proposition. And a warning." She set her mug down slowly, her instincts bristling. "Go on." "We've reviewed your proposal. The board was impressed. Some of them are even saying you're the kind of leadership the company needs right now, someone who doesn't disappear behind quarterly reports and polish." "But?" Savannah asked. "But Delilah's still pulling strings. She's quietly working the media narrative, painting you as emotionally erratic, a woman scorned, dragging children into a hostile takeover." Savannah closed her eyes. "Of course she is." "Here's the thing," Raymond continued. "The acquisition deal with Novex Europe, it's shaky. If it collapses, we lose billions in tech licensing and IP investors walk, stock dives. So let me guess," Savannah said coolly. "You want me to go quiet to protect the deal?" "No," Raymond replied. "I want you to go louder. Step into the spotlight. Publicly endorse the acquisition. Present it as part of your return to the company, as proof that the future of Coal Dynamics is about unity, not chaos." Savannah's throat tightened. "And what do I get?" "A permanent seat on the board. Title of executive chair. Full control over ethics and strategic compliance. And public vindication." She stared out the window of the cafe, watching New Yorkers shuffle through the morning fog, clutching coffee cups and ambition. "And the catch?" she asked. "You'll have to stand next to Jackson at the announcement." Savannah laughed, dry and humorless. The man who burned me publicly wants me to help rebuild his image? Number, he wants to rebuild yours, and the company's, but the visuals matter. If you want to own your narrative, this is how you do it. Raymond paused. And Savannah, if you don't, Delilah wins. And she won't stop at your reputation. She'll drag those kids through the dirt if it helps her. Savannah hung up without responding. Later that afternoon, Jackson stood on the rooftop garden of Coal Dynamics Midtown HQ, looking out at the skyline. The cold wind bit at his jawline, but he didn't move. Savannah stepped onto the roof in a deep navy trench coat, the wind tugging at her hair. Her heels clicked lightly against the stone, but he didn't turn until she stopped beside him. "They want me to stand with you," she said. He nodded. "I heard. And if I don't, they'll frame me as bitter and volatile. Again." "Yes." Savannah let out a slow breath. "This is what power feels like, huh? Being used no matter which side you choose." "No," Jackson said quietly. "Power is choosing anyway." She studied him, searching for the arrogance that once coated everything he said. But it wasn't there. Not today. Just a man who knew he'd burned bridges and was now willing to build one, even if he didn't get to cross it. "I'm not doing this for the company," she said. "I know. Not for you either." "I wouldn't ask you to." Savannah turned toward the skyline. "Then here's my condition. I speak, my words, my terms. I acknowledge the acquisition if the board agrees to an internal audit team that reports to me directly." Jackson nodded slowly. "Done. And," she added, "you make a public statement tomorrow, on camera, not just about Delilah's deception, but your own failure to believe the truth when it was right in front of you." This time he flinched. She didn't soften. "People need to hear it from you, Jackson, not some PR firm, not a press release." He turned to her, jaw tight. "You want me to bleed for this?" "No," Savannah said. "I want you to own it. There's a difference." He looked away, then nodded once. "You'll get it." She started to walk away, then paused. "One more thing." He looked up. "If you ever put those kids at risk, directly or indirectly, there won't be a conference or a headline or a single damn dollar that'll save you from me." He held her gaze. "I believe that." "Good." And with that, she turned and walked toward the elevator, her steps steady, her spine unflinching. In less than 48 hours, she'd stand beside the man who once shattered her, but not as a woman in his shadow, as his equal. And if Delilah thought Savannah had already played her best hand, she clearly hadn't realized that Savannah was the game now. Savannah had always known the truth was heavy, but what she hadn't expected was how lonely it would feel to be the one finally holding it in the light. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning. Midtown would be crawling with cameras, Coal Dynamics investors, and the kinds of journalists who live to chew on the drama of high society scandal. She'd agreed to stand beside Jackson on stage, but she hadn't agreed to smile. She wasn't sure if she even could. That night she sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sifting through old notes on the case. Lena had already tucked the twins into bed and disappeared upstairs, giving Savannah space she hadn't asked for but was silently grateful to receive. The files sat neatly stacked in a manila folder, labeled in Lena's crisp handwriting, Vaughn, internal memo thread, unverified sources. Savannah opened it and scanned the documents again, most of them emails Delilah had sent under various aliases. The paper trail was cleaner than she liked. Too clean. Something was missing. She reached for her phone and tapped out a message to Lena. "Need to recheck shell accounts under Preston's name. Think he's deeper in than we thought." She hit send. The response came back instantly. "Already on it. Just found a file labeled JCOLE/ASSETS_P. Not sure what it means yet." Savannah stared at the screen. A chill settled under her skin. Assets PP for Preston? Or something else? Before she could spiral further, her phone buzzed with a call. Jackson. She hesitated, then picked up. Savannah, he said, his voice unusually quiet. I just got off a call with Preston. Her stomach turned. What did he say? He's trying to leave the country. Took a private jet clearance out of Teterboro for Zurich tonight. And you're just telling me now? Her voice sharpened. I didn't find out until 10 minutes ago. He thinks Delilah is going to take the fall entirely, and that you're about to cut a deal with the board. Savannah stood, pacing now. What's he trying to hide? There was silence on the other end. Then Jackson spoke again, slower this time. Savannah, there's something you don't know. Her chest tightened. Then tell me. I didn't just push you out 5 years ago because of Delilah's numbers. Preston, he brought me something. What kind of something? A recording, Jackson admitted. An audio clip. It sounded like you and Theo, talking about draining one of the development funds. Preston said it was proof. I didn't ask where he got it, I just believed it. Savannah's mouth went dry. You thought I was stealing from you with Theo? I was wrong, Jackson said, voice low. I know that now, but back then I was spiraling. My father had just died, the board was on me about a failed merger, and I was convinced, hell, I wanted to believe you betrayed me, because it was easier than believing I'd let someone in too far. She dropped into the nearest chair, stunned. Savannah, he added, that file Lena just found? It may have the original audio Preston doctored. If we can prove he manipulated the recording, then Delilah didn't act alone, she finished, and we expose them both. Jackson paused. But if that recording goes public, it'll drag Theo into this. Savannah blinked. What are you talking about? I think Delilah used Preston to get that audio by tapping Theo's bakery, his office, maybe even his phone. She needed something personal to twist. And you and Theo were close back then. Savannah felt like the floor tilted beneath her. Theo, her anchor, her safe place. Had Delilah exploited even that? Her throat burned with the weight of too much betrayal, too little time. I'll handle it, she said finally. You focus on tomorrow's statement. Savannah, I mean it, Jackson. I'll deal with Preston and Theo and whatever else is coming. He didn't argue, just sighed. See you in the morning. She ended the call, her fingers trembling. She should have felt vindicated. The walls around Delilah were finally cracking, but all Savannah could feel was grief, for what had been twisted, for the people caught in the crossfire, for the version of her life that could have been if just one person had chosen to believe in her instead of rumors. And now even Theo wasn't untouched. She stood, stared at the file one more time, and whispered into the quiet, let it all come out, every last piece of it. Then she climbed the stairs, her body aching, and her mind sharper than ever. Because tomorrow, the world would see what power really looked like. Not wealth, not spin, not boardroom games, but a woman who refused to disappear. The cold bit harder than usual that morning, sharp enough to slice through Savannah's coat as she stepped onto the private airstrip in Teterboro. The runway buzzed with low-level activity, jet engines humming, baggage handlers moving like ghosts in reflective vests. But her eyes were locked on the sleek Gulfstream parked at the far end of the tarmac, steps already down, engines idling. Preston Whitaker stood halfway up the stairs, expensive carry-on slung over one shoulder, sunglasses perched low on his nose like he had nothing to hide. That was the thing about men like Preston. They always thought they were 2 steps ahead. Savannah wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. He saw her the moment she crossed the barricade, and for the first time in the years she'd known him, he looked rattled. She didn't give him time to decide whether to run. She just walked right up to the base of the stairs and looked up at him like she had every right to be there, because she did. "Going somewhere?" she asked. Savannah," he stammered, tugging off his sunglasses. "This is not the place for theatrics." "No theatrics," she said calmly. "Just a question. How long have you been selling out Jackson's company?" His lips twitched, his usual smugness flickering at the corners. "You really think this little crusade of yours is going to change anything? The company will survive. It always does." "Not if I bury it in litigation and federal investigations," she said flatly. "Which I will, if that's what it takes." He came down one step, leveling his gaze. "You've got no proof." "Actually," she said, reaching into her coat pocket, "I've got Lena. And she found your assets_P file. The one with the audio you doctored. The one Delilah asked you to bury me with." That landed. He exhaled sharply, his jaw twitching. "That was a mistake. I didn't know she'd actually use it to erase 5 years of my life? Discredit me in front of my husband? Cost my children their father?" Her voice cracked, and she hated it, but she didn't pull back. "Don't insult me by pretending you weren't complicit." "She made promises," he said bitterly. "Said we'd run the company together. She knew how to play him, and she played you harder." Savannah stared at him for a beat. Then, "You're a coward, Preston." He didn't deny it. "Give me the original files," she said. "All of them. Every trace of what she did. If you want to salvage even a fraction of your future, this is your only way out." He hesitated. "I walk on that plane," he said slowly, "and I'm free. My name's not on most of the paperwork. The trail stops with Delilah." Savannah stepped closer, her voice like glass. "You really want to bet that I won't pull every string I have? That I won't have the feds waiting in Zurich before you clear customs? Because I will, Preston. I will chase you down across continents if I have to. Not for me. For them." His eyes flicked away. "The kids. Yes, the ones you tried to erase with a lie." He looked at her then, and something in his face finally gave. Pride, denial, maybe both. "I'll send everything to Lena," he said after a long pause. "Tonight. I want out, Savannah. I'm done." She stepped back, watching him. "For what it's worth," he added, "he never stopped loving you. Jackson." Her chest clenched, but she kept her expression blank. "Too bad he stopped trusting me first." That night the press swirled with rumors of what tomorrow's conference would reveal. Theo showed up at the brownstone just after 10, his face tight, hands shoved in his pockets. Savannah let him in wordlessly. "I need to know," he said, voice low. "Did they use me?" She knew he meant Delilah. Preston. The mess behind the recording that shattered her life. "Yes," she said. "They used both of us." He looked down, jaw clenched. "I trusted you," he said softly, "even when I knew you were still in love with him." Her eyes stung. "And you were the only one who never asked me to prove I didn't do it." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Still would have stood by you even if you had." She stepped closer. "I know." Theo reached out, brushed a piece of hair from her cheek. The touch was soft, intimate, but not possessive. "You're going to blow that building up tomorrow, aren't you?" "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "Let whatever happens after happen." He nodded again. "Then go burn it down, Sav." She watched him walk away into the night, and when she closed the door, she stood there a moment longer, her hand resting over her chest, because the next time she walked into that boardroom, she wouldn't just be facing cameras or shareholders. She'd be facing the life she never got to have, and the one she was finally ready to claim. The lights were blinding. Savannah stood behind the podium in Coal Dynamics' soaring atrium, a wall of cameras pointed straight at her. Reporters lined the floor with their badges and clipboards, murmuring into tiny mics while producers barked countdowns into earpieces. Flashbulbs went off like distant thunder. She could see the headline forming already. Scandal-torn billionaire faces public reckoning with ex-wife by his side. Except she wasn't by Jackson's side. Not yet. Not until he earned that ground. She stood tall, her navy dress sleek and unflinching, hair pulled into a clean twist. The twins were safely tucked away upstairs with Lena and a security detail Savannah hand-picked herself. This moment? It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. Jackson stepped up beside her a moment later, looking almost too calm in his charcoal suit. But Savannah noticed the twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed once before gripping the mic. Good, she thought. Let it cost him something. He leaned forward, his voice crisp, audible through the soft feedback. Thank you all for coming. The crowd silenced instantly. I want to begin by addressing what we failed to see, both as a company and as individuals, Jackson said. In 2019, based on falsified data and manipulated recordings, I made a decision that destroyed my marriage, compromised this company, and betrayed the woman who helped me build it. Savannah kept her eyes forward. Cameras snapped like teeth. I believed people I shouldn't have. I acted on evidence I didn't verify. And I made Savannah Hart Cole a scapegoat for a problem I was too cowardly to face myself. He turned slightly to look at her, not performative, not staged, just a glance. But it landed. Today, I want to make it clear. Savannah did not embezzle. She did not commit fraud. She was not unstable or disloyal or untrustworthy. The lies that cost her everything were created by former executives who have since been removed from this company, and their actions, enabled by my silence, will be fully prosecuted. Gasps rippled. Whispers erupted behind hands. Jackson held his ground. She is the mother of my children, he continued, voice tighter now, and she is the only person who has ever held me accountable in ways I needed most. I failed her. I failed our family. And I owe it to them, to her, to spend the rest of my life doing better. He stepped back. Then Savannah moved forward. She didn't touch the microphone right away. She just looked at the room, the press, the executives, the world that once chewed her up and spit her out. My name, she said, is Savannah Hart Cole. And I'm not here today to be rescued or reinstated. I'm here because the truth finally has a platform. She could feel the silence deepen. 5 years ago, I was erased from this company, from my marriage, from my identity. I was labeled dangerous, ambitious, unpredictable. All the things women get called when they stop apologizing for being smart and driven and present. She looked directly into the camera now. I was pregnant when I was discarded, alone, stripped of my access, my dignity, and my reputation. I started over in a borrowed cottage with 2 babies and a sister who believed in me when no one else did. Lena, watching from upstairs, choked on a sob. Savannah continued. I didn't come back to settle a score. I came back because the lies didn't just cost me my life. They're the kind that rot the bones of an entire system. If we want companies like this to survive in the future, we need women like me not just on the board, but running it. A surge of murmurs filled the room. Investors shifted in their chairs. So, yes, I'm accepting the board's offer to return as executive chair of ethics and strategic operations. Not because I need their approval, but because this company is still part of my children's future, and they deserve to inherit something clean, something true. She looked at Jackson then, just briefly. And as for the man who stood beside me today, this isn't a reconciliation story, this is a recognition story, because recognition is the first step toward repair. Savannah stepped back from the podium to a room filled with a mix of silence, awe, and electric tension. She'd said what needed saying, and for the first time in 5 years, it was on record. Later, in the green room just off the atrium, Savannah leaned against the vanity, hands trembling now that the moment had passed. Jackson entered quietly, his tie loosened, expression unreadable. "You didn't have to say all that," he said. "Yes," she replied. "I did." He moved closer. "You were incredible." She gave a tired smile. "I didn't come to impress you." "I know." He exhaled. "But you did anyway." For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt like a pause that could break either way. He stepped forward, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel his warmth again. "You said this isn't a reconciliation," he said. "But do you think—" "One day it could be." Savannah looked up at him, at the man who had once broken her heart and was now standing in the ruins, trying to earn a piece of her trust. "I don't know," she said honestly. But her voice was softer now, not closed, just cautious. "Ask me again," she said, "when you've learned how to show up without needing to be the one who's right." Jackson nodded slowly, and this time he didn't try to fix it. He just stayed. Savannah hadn't cried in years. Not when she lost her marriage. Not when she gave birth alone. Not even when she moved into that drafty cottage with newborn twins and nothing but Lena's quiet strength to prop her up. But tonight, after the lights had gone out, after the cameras were unplugged, after the city turned its attention to the next scandal, she found herself sitting on the floor of her brownstone living room, her head resting against the arm of the couch, and letting the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just slow and steady. The kind of crying that felt less like a storm and more like an unfreezing. Across the room, Lena watched from the doorway. "You don't have to be strong tonight," she said gently. Savannah wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "I'm not trying to be, I don't know what to do now." "You did what you said you would. You told the truth. You protected the twins. You reclaimed your name." Savannah let out a tired laugh. "And yet I still feel hollow." "That's not hollowness," Lena said. "That's space. You cleared out everything that wasn't real. Now there's room for whatever comes next." Savannah looked up at her, eyes glassy. "I don't even know what I want anymore." Lena stepped in and knelt beside her. "That's because for the first time in 5 years, no one else is defining it for you." They sat there for a while, the quiet between them less heavy than it used to be. Finally, Lena asked, "Are you going to let him back in?" Savannah didn't answer right away, because she didn't know. Jackson had done what she never expected, admitted everything, owned it, publicly, without excuses. And part of her, God, part of her, wanted to lean into the warmth she still remembered, the way he used to pull her into his chest during cold nights, the way he looked at the twins like they were both miracle and penance. But another part of her knew love couldn't be real if it came on the heels of regret. He needed to be more than sorry. He needed to be changed. Jackson stood on the penthouse balcony with a drink he wasn't drinking. Below him the city glittered, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shifted the foundation of his life. Olivia stepped outside, handing him a folder. "Delilah's officially been indicted. Preston's flipping. DOJ's moving fast." He nodded, barely reacting. "You okay?" she asked. He gave a dry laugh. "You ever look at your life and realize you built a fortress with no doors?" Olivia arched a brow. Honestly, that sounds like something Savannah would say. That drew a smile from him, brief but real. She's always been the brave one. "She's also the one who showed up today with her spine straight and her past out in the open," Olivia said. "That wasn't just bravery, that was clarity." He nodded slowly. "You want her back?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then show her the man she was always fighting for, not the one who disappeared when it got hard. Jackson looked back at the skyline. I think I have to become him first. 2 days later, Savannah stood outside the preschool playground, watching Sophia try to balance on a little wooden beam while Eli offered coaching from the sidelines. The simplicity of it, sticky hands, scraped knees, tiny giggles, felt like a balm after the storm. Savannah? She turned to find Jackson a few feet away, hands in the pockets of a camel coat, eyes cautious. I didn't want to interrupt, he said. Just hoped I could talk for a minute. She studied him. He looked tired, yes, but also quieter. Less like the man who used to command rooms and more like the man who was finally learning how to enter them with humility. I have 5, she said. He stepped beside her, not too close. Just enough. I've been thinking a lot, he began, about who I was when I built this company, when I married you, when I lost you. She didn't interrupt, just let him speak. I think I used to believe love was something you earned by being impressive, by building big things and solving problems fast. But with you, I never had to be impressive. I just had to be present, and I failed at that. Savannah's throat tightened. I've started therapy, he continued. I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations, focusing on the foundation, on the twins, on learning how to be still with things I don't control. She turned toward him, her voice soft. That's new for you. He nodded. It's also terrifying. She smiled faintly. I'm not asking for anything, he said. Not yet. I just wanted you to know I'm trying, and I'm not going anywhere. Savannah looked back at the kids. Sophia had fallen, but Eli had helped her up. They laughed and ran toward the slide like falling down was just part of the game. She turned back to Jackson. They're still getting to know you. I know. And so am I. He nodded again. Then let's keep showing up. She didn't say yes. She didn't reach for him, but she didn't walk away either. And maybe in this new life they were building, not from scratch, but from truth, that was enough. For now. The scent of fresh paper and black ink filled the room. Savannah sat at the long glass conference table at Cole Dynamics, the city skyline behind her, a stack of signed board resolutions to her left. The final piece was in her hands, a clean contract, ready for her signature. The permanent seat, executive chair, full oversight, total control, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd earned. But the pen hovered. Jackson stood across from her, not saying a word. He hadn't tried to influence her, not since that day at the playground. Since then, they'd kept their distance, meeting only to coordinate transition plans, occasional drop-offs, polite exchanges over schedules. He had respected her boundaries. More than that, he'd respected her silence. And that, more than anything, had rattled her. Because the Jackson she'd once loved had always filled space, with his confidence, his certainty, his voice. But now, he left space open for her to speak. Everything looks in order, said the attorney, eyes darting between Savannah and the unsigned page. Just need your signature. She glanced at Jackson. He held her gaze. He didn't smile, didn't try to charm her. He just waited, like a man who finally understood that love wasn't something you demanded. It was something you invited and hoped would return. She looked back down. The offer was a good one, better than she'd imagined. With her name on that paper, she could reshape the company from the inside, protect the culture, shield her kids' future, plant roots in a legacy that had once spit her out. But it would also tie her to this place, to these people, to Jackson. Even now, the part of her that had clawed her way out of that cold, lonely penthouse still flinched. She'd become someone else in those years, not someone new, just someone more fully herself, a mother, a leader, a woman who didn't need to be validated to stand tall. She had been driven out. She had returned. And now, she had a decision. Slowly, Savannah set the pen down. "I'm not signing it," she said softly. The attorney blinked. "Excuse me?" She looked up at Jackson. "Not like this." He nodded, as if he knew what was coming. "I don't want power because it makes people uncomfortable not to give it to me. I want it because I've built something of my own, on my own terms, not as a symbol of redemption, not as a compromise to clean up after a mess someone else made." She turned to the attorney. "I'll stay on for 6 months. Interim oversight. During that time, we restructure the ethics division and launch a public impact initiative tied to underserved communities, something Lena's team helps lead. After that, I step back. My legacy won't be tethered to this company's damage control. It'll be something my kids can be proud of without conditions." The attorney looked nervously toward Jackson. But Jackson just smiled, not with surprise, with understanding. "You're making the right choice," he said. She studied him for a beat. "I know." Later, they walked out of the building together for the first time in 5 years. The wind tugged at her coat. Jackson walked beside her with no agenda, no script, just presence. "You were never meant to come back here permanently," he said. "Were you?" "No," she replied. "I was meant to rise, and then leave." He nodded. "Do you hate me for wanting you to stay?" She stopped walking. "Number. But I can't stay in something just because it finally wants me now." He laughed under his breath. "You know, when I first built this company, I thought success was about control. And then I met you and realized it was about trust. And when I lost you, I remembered why I'd always avoided both." Savannah looked at him, her voice low. "What are you avoiding now?" He met her gaze. "Nothing anymore." They stood in the streetlight glow, traffic murmuring behind them, the world moving forward in a million ways. And for a brief moment, there was no audience, no courtroom, no boardroom, no ghosts, just 2 people. "What happens next?" he asked. Savannah smiled. Slow, small, certain. "You show up. For them. For you. For you, Jackson. Not for some image or punishment or apology. You do the work, even when no one's watching." "And for you?" She tilted her head. "If that's who you become, then maybe there's a space in my life for you again. But not at the cost of the life I've built, not at the cost of myself." He nodded, and it wasn't resigned. It was something better. It was hopeful. He reached out, gently brushing her knuckles with his, not holding, just a quiet offering. She didn't pull away. And in that small, unspoken moment, Savannah knew she didn't need revenge. She didn't need redemption. She already had something better. Wholeness. The laughter hit her first. Savannah stepped into the sunlit community center, a modest brick building in downtown Brooklyn, its freshly painted exterior paid for in part by the new ethical fund she'd helped Coal Dynamics launch. Inside, children zipped back and forth between coding tablets and art easels. Music played low in the background. A faint smell of cinnamon muffins drifted in from somewhere near the kitchen. She spotted Eli and Sophia instantly, curled up with a group of other kids and a smiling volunteer who looked half overwhelmed, half enchanted. Sophia had wrapped a pink feather boa around her neck like she was ready to host a Broadway show. Eli was explaining a game he'd invented, complete with rules, scoring, and an imaginary currency he insisted was way more stable than Bitcoin. Savannah leaned against the doorframe and watched them. This was what she came back for. Not a title, not an empire, but a legacy that looked like them. Confident, joyful, curious, unburdened. Jackson stepped up beside her a moment later, holding 2 cups of coffee from the local cafe down the block. He passed her one without speaking. She took it. "Look at them," he murmured. I do. Every day. He nodded, gaze still on the twins. It's wild, isn't it? How much life they carry in such small bodies. It's also wild how resilient they are, Savannah said. They've survived press chaos, security details, boardroom whispers, and still lead with trust. That's because they've had you, he said. She glanced at him, and for once, she didn't feel the reflex to guard herself. He'd been showing up, quietly, consistently. There was no dramatic return, no lavish gestures, just check-ins, story times, weekend lunches. He even learned to braid Sophia's hair, badly at first, but he never gave up. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to build something new. I've been thinking, he said after a beat, about legacy. You mean the foundation? He nodded. The name felt like a placeholder at first, a brand, but now... It feels like a promise, she finished. Exactly. They both sipped their coffee in silence for a moment. The kids erupted into giggles across the room as someone knocked over a tower of cardboard blocks. Jackson glanced at her. I was going to ask you something. Savannah turned. What? He hesitated, searching her face. But then he smiled. A real one, soft and unforced. Never mind. I don't want to ask anything today. I just want to be here. Savannah's chest loosened, the kind of breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. She looked back at the kids. Me too. That afternoon, she sat on the back patio of the brownstone while Lena read on the other side of the table, sunglasses perched on her nose and a dog-eared novel in hand. You're glowing, Lena said without looking up. Savannah laughed. I'm not pregnant. God, I hope not. That's not what I meant. Savannah tilted her head. Then what? You're still. Calm. Lena looked at her now. Like your soul finally stopped pacing. Savannah leaned back in her chair, eyes closed against the warm sunlight. I think I stopped waiting for someone to fix it. Or break it again. Lena smiled. I'm proud of you. You should be proud of yourself, too. None of this happens without you. I didn't do it for thanks. I know, Savannah said. That's why you deserve it. They sat in silence, the kind that came from shared battles and scar tissue and hard-won peace. Eventually, Savannah said, Jackson didn't ask today. For anything good, Lena said. Let him earn the right to ask if you ever want to hear it. I don't know what I want yet. Lena shrugged. That's growth. Savannah smiled to herself. She didn't need to rush the ending. It wasn't a romance novel tied with a bow. It was her life. And the beauty of life was in how it unfolded, moment by moment. No longer dictated by trauma. No longer dictated by power. Just choice. That night, Savannah tucked the twins into bed. Eli insisted on 2 stories, and Sophia wanted the nightlight shaped like a unicorn turned exactly 17 degrees. After they drifted off, she stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, exhaling deeply. A soft knock on the door. Jackson stood there, still in his dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. I brought back your charger, he said, holding up the familiar white cord. You left it at the office. She took it, smiling slightly. Thanks. I know it's late, he said. But, can I ask one thing? She raised an eyebrow. Depends on the question. Would you ever come back? He asked. Not to the company. To us, in time. Savannah looked at him. She didn't rush the answer. I don't know, she said, her voice steady. But I'm not ruling it out. He nodded, didn't push, just stepped back. I'll see you tomorrow. And with that he left. No promises, no pressure, just presence. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. It was Eli and Sophia's 5th birthday. Savannah stood in the center of Theo's bakery, now reopened, now co-owned with a non-profit arm that employed local teens and sponsored a mentorship program. The air smelled of buttercream and fresh croissants, and sunlight poured through the wide front windows, painting the hardwood floors in gold. There were balloons in every corner, most of them slightly lopsided, because Eli had insisted on doing half of them himself. A playlist of kid-friendly jazz played softly in the background, curated by Sophia, who'd declared pop music too basic. Friends and family milled about, neighbors, classmates, a few colleagues from the Legacy Initiative. Savannah wore a simple cream dress and no heels. She didn't need to stand taller anymore. She was tall enough now, in every way that mattered. She looked around the bakery and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not closure, just peace. 5 years ago, she had stood in front of this very counter, pregnant and lost and too ashamed to cry. Theo had made her coffee and handed her a quiet kind of hope. Today, that hope was everywhere. Sophia shrieked with delight as Jackson lifted her high into the air to hang a final streamer. Eli tugged at his pant leg, already explaining the rules to the cupcake scavenger hunt Savannah had absolutely not approved. Jackson looked so different now. Softer, lighter, like he'd taken off a suit he didn't even realize he'd been wearing his whole life. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said no. But they were here, all of them, together. Theo came up beside her with a smile and 2 lemon tartlets. "Still your favorite?" he asked, handing her one. "Always," Savannah said, accepting it with a grin. "You've built something, you know," he said, glancing around the room. "Something bigger than a name or a company or a headline." Savannah took a bite, savoring the sharp, sweet citrus. "It feels like a beginning." "It is," Theo said. "You can finally write the rest on your terms." She looked at him, grateful. They had never become lovers, but they had become something else, something enduring. The kind of love that didn't ask for more than you could give, that knew when to hold and when to let go. A flashbulb went off, and Savannah turned to see Jackson holding up a Polaroid camera and pointing it at the kids. Sophia struck a dramatic pose. Eli grinned like a boy who believed joy was his birthright. Savannah laughed, genuinely. Jackson caught her eye, lowered the camera, and just looked at her, not with the hunger of someone trying to win her back, not with guilt or longing, just recognition, and in return, she nodded, softly, just once. It said everything. "Yes, I see you. Yes, I forgive you. No, I haven't forgotten. Yes, maybe someday." He smiled and returned to the chaos of icing and glitter and sugar-sticky fingers. Later, when the candles were blown out and the kids had declared themselves officially ancient, Savannah gathered them on her lap and read them the storybook she'd written just for them. It wasn't about princes or villains or palaces. It was about a tree that lost all its leaves, but grew back stronger because of the wind. When she finished, Eli asked, "Mommy, was the tree you?" Savannah looked at her son. "No, baby. The tree was us." Sophia nestled in closer. "So we're strong now." Savannah kissed the top of her head. Stronger than ever. And they were. They had come through fire, through lies, through silence. And what remained, what had grown in place of what was burned, was something honest, something whole, something real. Savannah didn't know if she and Jackson would end up together again, but she knew they were family. She knew her children would grow up surrounded by love that didn't have to be perfect to be powerful, and she knew she would never again ask for permission to take up space in her own story. The past had tried to break her. The future belonged to her now, and she was ready for it.